right, so I will start. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're coming from the United States. Welcome, everyone, no matter which time zone you are. And that's a unique opportunity for me to be part of this virtual experience. Today, I'm going to talk about lessons, my personal lessons that I've taken for the period that I'm working not with core, but I'm not a core maintainer, I'm not core committer, just a person who works with Drupal source code, with Drupal in general for several years. I have started with Drupal 6, now we are Drupal 9. Hopefully soon we'll have greater and newer versions of Drupal core. So let's see what lessons you can learn and what lessons I have personally learned from working together with Drupal core, with using it in everyday projects. Before we begin, the slides are available with a short link. It's bit.ly/reason for that. So you can check this address. I have tried to make all links clickable. So if you see links to specific projects or documentation pages, feel free to do that. We have Else, welcome Else, like a moderator. So if you have any questions, please ask on the session page, because I will be kind of blind. I'm used to deliver presentations with 2 screens, but you know, working from home has its drawbacks, so we need to live with that. So let's start. Several words about myself. My name is Valery, Val for short. And looking to my picture, you can understand why my nick is Val the Bold. It's not the bold. I hope I am bold as well, if you spell bold with O. But that's the nick, Val the Bold. You can find me with this nickname on virtually any social network, maybe except TikTok. I'm too old for that. But on Drupal, Skype, Facebook, Twitter, you name it. So it's about the Bolt. I maintain several projects on Drupal.org. Recently, I'm more facilitated with examples for developers. So that's the model that is not intended for the use on the production websites. Instead, this model that contains pieces of code that developers are welcome to use in their projects to copy, paste, modify them a little bit, and so on. In addition to that, I also maintain data, meta tags quick, a couple of other projects, and I also part of the mentoring team. You probably heard about Friday, which is a contribution day during DrupalCons. That DrupalCon is not an exception. That will be interesting to have this contribution day in a virtual environment, but so far, my personal experience from using on-air platform are quite good. Would be even better if we have like deep links, so that it would be possible for me to send links to specific session, or for example to a contribution room, or to specific table inside contribution room. But maybe on the next DrupalCon, in the worst case that we have it still in a virtual environment. Hopefully we have next year DrupalCon with a real meeting with people, which I miss a lot, but still. So you're welcome to join tomorrow contribution day. If you have friends or colleagues who didn't buy ticket for DrupalCon, contribution day is free. So everyone is welcome. I work for a company named Dropsolid. It's a Belgium-based company based in Ghent. That's the company that gave a name to the new era pronounced by Dries during his keynote, that we are now in the era of digital experience. And that's DXP, digital experience, is one of the mottos and one of the goals of Dropsolid as a company, and we see delivering the best possible digital experience for our clients, for the visitors of our clients. It's one of our primary goals. So today we'll talk about several things. We'll talk about core release cycle, not about code, documentation, which is not about code once again. How do we manage dependencies and what are dependencies at all? Why do we need them? What is dependency injection? Tests, code style, and how do I learn new stuff when working with Drupal? I'm a backend developer, but strangely, I would like to start with something non-code related. So I think that first and most important lesson that I have learned from the Drupal development, from the Drupal core and its history, is that having predictable workflow, having predictable release cycles is much more important than having bleeding edge technology, using the most modern, yesterday released JavaScript libraries, just released standards for HTML, CSS, linting, and so on and so on. This is all important, and these are all things that make us as developers happy. I think there are no developers who do not like to learn new stuff, and that's great. But there are things that are more important. So let's look at these two pictures, at these two graphs. Here you can see two graphs. One, the left slide is number of days that each major Drupal core version was developed for, starting from the first beta or alpha, if we talk about Drupal 7 and beyond, and until the release date. So you can clearly see that for Drupal 5, there were only 2 months between the first beta release and the final release. For Drupal 6, it was already something like half a year, Drupal 7, a year, and Drupal 8, it's a whopping 3 years. So it's 3 years for uncertainty for the possible future users of this CMS, and it's 4 years from the moment that we have general understanding what the final release would be until we see that release published on Drupal.org and recommended for the use on the production sites. Then on the right graph, you can see number of days between the first release of one major release version of Drupal core and first release of the next major version. So the red bar is number of days since release of Drupal 5.0 until first release of Drupal 6.0. Yellow bar is before Drupal 6.0 until Drupal 7.0. And finally, between Drupal 7.0 and Drupal 8.0.0. So you can see that for Drupal 8, it was, and we know that 5 years has passed since release of Drupal 7. And 5 years, if you don't work with stable mature technology like PHP, if that's an epoch. So if I don't know how many JavaScript frameworks have passed for these 5 years. There is a saying that if you're just a developer, you need to learn everything from scratch every year. If you're a JavaScript developer, then you must do that every 6 months. But anyway, these 5 years have made very big negative impact on the ecosystem of Drupal, including its developers, It's the companies that develop sites with Drupal, and of course clients. Because what was wrong with this release cycle? There was a saying and motto of Drupal core release cycle that for the question when the next version of Drupal core will be released, the right answer is when it will be ready. So any major client, the company with big sacks of money, they simply didn't have enough intent to use Drupal for their systems because they couldn't predict whether in 3 years they will be able to use the next version of Drupal core, which promises these new features that are marketed by different companies that work with Drupal, or they will have to stack with the current release of Drupal. So the damage was, it is really hard to overestimate the damage that was made by this approach. So luckily, starting from Drupal 8, the Drupal community, the Drupal core team have adopted a new system. And now we can know for sure when the next major and minor version of Drupal core will be released. So we have minor version every 6 months. We have patch versions every month. And we have clear definition what is minor version, which changes are allowed in minor versions, which changes are allowed only in major versions. And patch versions are mostly bug fixes. And if there are new features in patch versions, they absolutely must be backwards compatible. So for now, we know for sure when Drupal 8 will lose its security support. And we know that Drupal 7 will have longer life than Drupal 8. The reason for that is that the transition from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 and from Drupal 9 to Drupal 10 should be much easier than for Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. So there are a lot of companies in the wild that are stuck with Drupal 7, and they need more time to prepare transition to newer versions of Drupal, or they may decide to go to other content management systems. Read more links to the document that describes which changes are allowed for major, minor patch versions and so on. So you're welcome to check it. So that's for me is the most important lessons. And of course, it can be applied not only to the work on Drupal core, but I personally work mostly on the client projects. And the same approach works for client projects as well. So for clients, it's much more important to know when they will have a certain feature or the certain set of features than to know that all features that they have in mind, and you know that client can be very creative with coming with their requirements and for the new features. So still, it's more important for them to know that they can have feature A, B, C in 2 months, and you cannot say when you can provide features A, B, C, D, E, F, and so on and so on. So how did Drupal core team manage to do that? Because you must understand that it's not just saying that Drupal core will be released whenever it's ready. It was the way of working on Drupal core. So if you say that you oblige to have next minor version in 6 months, or to have end of life for Drupal 8 in 2 years, what does it mean? And why does it happen? How does it work? So first thing to understand is that now because Drupal is not anymore self-contained system, and all the code that is in Drupal is written for Drupal. So one of the things that happened in Drupal 8 is the shift of ideology of Drupal from the paradigm of not invented here and we will not use it, to another more open paradigm proudly invented elsewhere. So if there is some component that is already written and it's already written for another content management system or as independent component, Drupal 8 and beyond will use it instead of writing its equivalent and storing in Drupal repository. And that means that in addition to Drupal core itself, modern Drupal core consists of core itself and also its dependencies, the components that do not belong to Drupal core, but are used by it. And these components have their own constraints. So when we talk about Drupal, the biggest dependency of Drupal 8 and 9 is Symfony, which has its own release cycle. It has requirements for every version. It has clear policy for deprecation of older components. It has clear policy for adopting new PHP versions. In addition to Symfony, there are other components like jQuery UI. So what happened last year, maintainers of jQuery UI claim that they stop development this utility, this library. So since Drupal 8 uses jQuery UI, the core team has to find a replacement and do it in a way that makes all existing Drupal 8 sites still function, the sites that require jQuery UI, and the newer sites can still work with the same models, with the same component, but without jQuery UI, because Drupal core has provided equivalents for every sub-library for jQuery UI. The second lesson, which is related to the previous one, is write the tests. So one of the things that helped Drupal to fit into this 6-month release cycle and to not have regressions and to not have critical bugs after new features are introduced is having tests. And I know that people don't have usually time for writing tests, and it's hard to start doing so. So there's very short summary of how you can start doing that. This is described on Drupal.org's documentation page, and you can follow it. So basically, you have to have locally Composer dependencies, install them with Composer install as you install other third-party dependencies like contributed models or the JavaScript libraries. Then you need to copy phpunit.xml.dist to phpunit.xml into the root of your project and add database credentials and site name, so that, because obviously phpunit.xml file shipped with Drupal core is not aware of your local credentials. Then you should create a folder for the output and run the tests. There are a lot of guides for writing the tests and types of tests that exist in Drupal core. I recommend you, if you haven't done so, watch the session of Oliver Davis that happened on Tuesday here on DrupalCon, and he explained different types of tests very clearly, and you can follow this session to start writing the tests. But the importance of tests is also hard to overestimate. It's a way to have predictable release cycle as well, because you cannot, you still can, but if you have good tests coverage for your source code, for your code base, the chance that you will find yourself with a big number of regression issues is lower compared to the situation that you don't have any tests. Third lesson that I learned is about code style. I know that there are some people who think that this requirement of Drupal core to have specific syntax, to have a specific number of spaces before function name, before parameter name, can be found maybe too restrictive. But then it helps you if you want to find specific snippet of code. If you follow the Drupal coding style, then you know what to search for. Otherwise, you don't know how many spaces was in the function name, was the name with the capital case or small case, so things like that. So for static analysis of the source code, Drupal core uses PHP coding standard and PHP mess detector. And there are similar tools for JavaScript and CSS. Also, with newer versions of Drupal core, there is a requirement to specify parameter and return type, and that also makes PHP more close to statically typed languages like C and C++, so that we can prevent errors even before runtime, just when writing the code and running static analysis tool. Fourth lesson is that the commands exist in the source code for some reason. And you can imagine that if you have a vast code base like Drupal core that today has more lines of code of JavaScript than there were lines of PHP in Drupal 5. So you can imagine that keep documentation about that source code in sync with the actual source code can be quite a daunting task. Luckily, we have PHP documenter tool. And if you go to api.drupal.org and search for any class name or function name, you can see that actually this documentation is always in sync with the source code because it is generated from the source code. And that's a good reason for writing comments in the code, for documenting what are parameter types for every class method, for every function. And once again, this is an approach that can be applied not only to Drupal core, but also to the client projects. And I have worked on several client projects where this approach was used for providing project documentation to the client, so that in the end, the client gets the whole code base because we work with the source code and we give source code to the client. And in addition to that, there are tools that generate from PHP documenter from the set of HTML pages, PDF file, which is again handed over to the client, either in electronic or in printed form. And that's very helpful and beneficial for the project. So I have already mentioned that the approach has significantly changed to the code that can be reused from the code that was written for another project in versions of Drupal core prior to 8. There were wrappers for things like string length or similar. So this is a very famous picture, the learning curve for popular CMS. And you can see for WordPress or Joomla or Modix, learning curve is quite predictable. And for Drupal, you can learn it and then you can think that you have understood most of it. And then suddenly you face a wall and cannot continue. And one of the reasons for that was that there were too many Drupalisms inside the code, too many concepts that were specific to Drupal so that it was hard to learn. So from not invented here paradigm, there was a big shift in Drupal 8 to the paradigm called proudly invented elsewhere. And it all started with two very basic tasks. So when the team has started to work on Drupal 8, the first components to replace in Drupal 7 were, first component was to perform HTTP request, a task that is done in practically every CMS. So it should be already a library for that. This HTTP request component should support streams. It should support all operations, not only get and post, and more, and be as universal as possible. And the second task was replacing the routing system. For those of you who didn't work with Drupal 7 and before, there were two hooks in Drupal 7. One for providing menu items and second for altering either the same menu items or menu items for coming from different models. So these were the two tasks to replace in Drupal 7. And after long discussion, Drupal core teams suggested two components. One component was Guzzle. That's widely used HTTP request library. Originally, it was a wrapper, quite a thin one around curl library. And nowadays, it can work even in the systems where curl library does not present, which is a rare case, but still you can use Guzzle in this system as well. Second component, or let's say set of components, was Symfony routing. And that was the beginning of big of Symfony coming to Drupal. So luckily for us, and one of the reasons that Symfony routing was chosen, that it has also HTTP request response components. And both these components use Guzzle as the transport layer. So it started only with two components, and now the list, as you can see, is much longer, and the influence of Symfony on the Drupal project is quite big. Now, when I ask myself what's the most important component of Symfony, or what's the most important influence of Symfony on Drupal, I would name dependency injection. So if you don't know what is dependency injection, is one of the techniques of inversion of control. So let's say if you have one service, one component that requires, let's say we have a node model, and it needs to display the node entity. And in order to do that, this node class node entity needs to know what is the current language. So the standard approach would be to say that node entity class or node entity storage depends on language component, on language class. But that way, every time we change something in the language component, there is a chance that we break node and any other component that requires language. So dependency injection kind of inverses this situation. And instead of telling that a node entity requires language as a class, we only define interfaces. And that means that we fix what properties should the language service provide us in order for the node entity to work properly, in order to display the node entities on the page. So That way, we can have swappable implementation of these services and traditional terminology of dependency injection that we have the client, in our case, the node entity, and the service. The service in our case is a language component, language class, doesn't matter how you name it. So we can swap implementation on the fly. We can have third-party models that replace default implementation. And more than that, it makes the tests easier because for the testing purposes, the language component is quite the light one. But imagine that you have as a service something that talks to the third-party system, like a web service. For example, you're working on a site that should display shares in real time. So you need to be sure that when the change in stock share happens, the page is displayed automatically. So if you use real services on real life, that's okay. But writing the tests for this situation becomes a nightmare because no one can guarantee that the change in real stock price happen at the moment you run the tests. So in order to do that, to test the change of stock share, you replace the real component, the real service, with the test one that performs the stock price change at the moment you need it. For examples of implementation of dependency injection, I personally recommend language model because it's quite a small one and it has observable list of services in language services.yaml. If you wonder how we can do dynamic stuff, because in Drupal 7 and earlier, you were able to define services or their analog in Drupal 7 with PHP functions, while in Drupal 8, you have a static structure of YAML files. So there is a solution for that. You can alter services exposed by the current model or other models with service provider classes. And you can also take an example of service provider classes in the same language model. One dependency injection concept that is not covered in language model, although there is an issue in Drupal core issue queue to cover that as well, is a concept of decoration. If you're interested in that as well, you can check workspaces model. It has implementation of decorate pattern. So talking about original components that were taken from Symfony into Drupal core, I have told that the routing subsystem was the original component, and the quality of this component was so high that Drupal core decided to take other components in use as well. So that's the routing subsystem of Symfony. It's based on Symfony routing. You can check the routing replaces hook menu and hook menu alter that existed in Drupal 7. In Drupal 8, the main file for routing is model name.routing.yaml. You can check an example with the same in the same language model. There are different ways to express or to define routes. So to have a broader picture, I would check not only language model, but also command. And together, these two models give a good example what routing YAML can look like and what can be its entries. So in addition to routing YAML, there are also components that complement it and define in addition to routing themselves. So for those of you who don't know, routing is a way of translating human readable URL of your website, like /fr/homepage to internal root, and then calling required page callback and returning the result and storing it in the cache and many other stuff. So this is routing. This is the routing subsystem of Drupal. And once again, similar to services components, to services dependency injection component, definition of routes can be both static and dynamic. So most of the needs for a typical website are covered in static routing.yaml file, but you can also define route altering services, and they will manage, they can alter existing routes in a dynamic way. So next lesson is that if you don't understand how things work, then you can debug it. And that also means that if you don't know how to, because debugging can be a hard task, enabling debugging in a local environment, especially if you don't have any local installation, can be a pressing task. So if you don't have local installation of Drupal and want to debug things and want to see what happens inside every Drupal request, every HTTP request, you should use Xdebug, and you should use it inside a Docker container. That's the faster start. So if you have already worked in local environment and you use MAMP or XAMPP or any other stack that works locally on your computer, that's fine. If you know how to install, enable Xdebug on this local stack, that's fine as well. But if you don't have anything, the fastest way to have Drupal running locally with optional Xdebug is having Docker images. So you can use several of pre-built Docker Drupal specific images. I have listed only several of them. You can use the image of your choice. In Dropsolid, we have our own Docker platform called Dropsolid Launchpad. So you can use it as well. It is built for use with Dropsolid Cloud. But as I said, you can use any Docker images that are built for Drupal, and all of them support Xdebug, and it's quite easy to do that. I'll try to perform some quick demonstrations. So let's say I have Drupal running locally. It's Drupal 9. So let's see what happens if I go to homepage. So it all starts with index.php, which is quite simple. It has some auto load, which comes from Composer. And then that's the most significant part, where it's where all the magic happens in Drupal kernel. There's some initialization. And then we have an endless nested calls of different components. So here you can see that there are a lot of things happening before we even send requests to a page controller. And in some cases, for example, when we have page cache or dynamic page cache, requests doesn't even hit page controller. And that makes the whole Drupal site work much faster than we had in Drupal 7 case out of the box. So I have talked with many people who saw both Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 in their vanilla state, and all of them say that Drupal 8 works much faster out of the box. Of course, it's also explained by the fact that caching is enabled by default, but still. So you can do that quite easy, and with standard Docker images, Xdebug works quite fast. And that's a good way to understand what happens inside every HTTP request that involves Drupal. And the last and also a very important lesson is how you can learn stuff, how you can learn more things. And that also was the way for me. Is, well, there is a common saying for engineers that experience varies directly with equipment ruined. Luckily, we don't work with real equipment, and maximum that we can break is the client side that has already several millions of clients, and it gets a lot of damage from not working. But still, it's the situation for us is better than for real engineers, and more importantly, you can save some time and don't break the client sides by working on something in Drupal core. So you can pick some small issues, because the easiest way to learn something is to do something. So if you're interested in how Drupal core works and want to understand more, you should go into Drupal core issue queue and pick some issue that is broken. Well, if you have something specific that you're interested in, that's the best. If you don't have anything specific, you can come to the mentoring team, the people who can advise with a pick and device issue, or so if you're not sure what you're going to work on. But still, you can save that. You can save time both. You can save time and money of the client by not breaking the client side. Instead, you can break your own site on your local environment, and that's much better. So, and said so, I invite everyone to come tomorrow. Tomorrow we have contribution day, as I mentioned in the beginning. So we have first time contributor workshop starting from 10 o'clock. And for people who already know how the Drupal core issue queue is working, what is the flow, they can directly join mentor contribution, or they can join general contribution if they are more experienced. But anyone, everyone is welcome tomorrow, and no ticket is required. So please come. That was everything from my side. So if there are any questions, I would be glad to answer them.
Thank you so much, Valerie. That was very enlightening. I learned a lot. Um, I see there are no questions in the Q&A yet, but I will right now put a link in the chat where people can follow you, because we have a different platform where you can have all your questions in a live Q&A with Valerie. So if you have any questions, please follow us. You can also have a one-on-one with Valerie if you should have any questions about all the things that he's presented this 45 minutes. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. I did. Valerie, thank you very much for the interesting session.
Thank you. And if you, again, if you want to follow the slides, you can follow this short link, bit.ly/reason for that. And see you soon. Thank you.